Mike hit us up, big friend of the show from Orlando, Florida, and Mike said, is Nick Saban complaining about NIL and Dabo Swinney going back on his word about never using the portal evidence that they're getting desperate? Now, you can look at this one of 14 different ways. Desperation, though, is an interesting word to use there, Mike. So we've got a very, very love relationship, me and the audience around here, and sometimes, because we are so close and so tight-knit, I can afford to talk to you the way I'm about to talk to Mike. Anyone calling Nick Saban desperate right now, or Dabo Swinney desperate because of the things they've said about, in Dabo's case, things like the portal, or Saban's case, things like NIL, I don't know that, I know what you're trying to get at, Mike. I don't know if desperation's the word. And maybe if you had it to tweet over again, what a phrase there, maybe if you had it to tweet over again, maybe if you and I were sitting here talking, you'd choose a different word. But we're not, and you chose desperate. So I'm going to roll with desperate. Claiming that someone like Dabo Swinney or someone like Nick Saban right now is desperate is just a fundamental lack of understanding of what competing at the highest levels of anything consists of. They better be desperate. They better have been desperate long before now, and I'm pretty sure that they have been, and they have been paranoid, and they've been everything that most people are not, and that's what gets you to the top of an industry or a sport or a company or what have you. Desperation, I think, is code for a lot of the critical factors and traits that go into being the type of personality that it takes to run a big organization. They don't think like you. Well, I don't know about you, Mike. I'm just saying in general, they don't think like the average person. They don't act like the average person. They don't care about what the average person cares about. But when you start calling coaches desperate, merely because they're rubbed the wrong way by something, or because they seem paranoid about something you don't think is a big deal, or you think should be embraced, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what it's like competing at the highest levels. I'm not talking about competing for the sake of competing. I'm talking about competing at the highest levels. They're all desperate. Every one of them's desperate. It's the same crowd throwing out that label of, ooh, look at them, they're desperate. That same crowd is the kind of crowd that snickers when they take an opponent serious, even though they're favored by 30 against them. When they're up by 42 in the fourth quarter and they're still chewing players out, that's the kind of crowd that jukes each other in the ribs and says, look at him. Look at this act he's putting on. It's not an act. It's not an act at all. You see those coaches dead serious, zoned in. The same reason that they're taking every opponent as seriously as the next opponent is the mechanism that makes them different. It elevates them. And Saban's been there a long time. And Dabo Swinney, while I'm certainly not saying he's Nick Saban's equal, he has elevated his program to a different level. It only takes once. You see, growing up, if you grew up with nothing, you have a certain advantage over people who grew up with something. And that advantage is you know what it's like to be broke. You know what it's like to not have something. You know what it's like to live in despair. And if you've ever lost in college football, for example, as a 20 or 30-point dog or favorite, it only takes once. Humility, 1 week away. It only takes once. Think about Marshall, Notre Dame this past year. Just to pull an example from this past year. Marcus Freeman, first year as a head coach. They lose to Ohio State. Oh, well. They lose to Marshall. He'll never forget it. They will never overlook an opponent, and I'm not claiming they overlooked that one, but they will never forget that. And that will set a standard, and it'll be etched in stone from now throughout the remainder of his tenure in South Bend, Indiana. 5 years or 50 years, they will point to the Marshall game. That Marshall team wasn't good when they came into South Bend. They weren't good when they left. They had an otherwise forgettable season, but they beat us, which means if it happened once, it could happen again. Is that desperation? It's not desperation. That's just holding yourself to a really, really high standard. So with Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney, Mike said in his question, well, Saban's complaining about this NIL stuff. I've had a lot of other people in my DMs that we haven't used on air who have taken it a step further. And they said, or they've asked me, I guess, is Nick Saban scared of NIL? Saban's scared of NIL. Dabo Swinney's scared of the transfer portal. Well, there's a difference in fear of something and just not liking something. You know, Nick Saban's done this, it feels like a dozen times before, spoken out about something changing in the game. And some folks have made the mistake of thinking that his frustration is fear. You got the first letter right, but you didn't get the corresponding letters right. No, it's not fear. I think he's shown you time and again he can be rubbed the wrong way about something, doesn't get his way, shrugs it off, changes his entire format or whatever it takes in that particular vein, and then just continues to win and win and win. With Dabo Swinney, he has been outspoken in the past and mischaracterized in the process about how he doesn't care to use the transfer portal. He never said he wouldn't do it. That is a misnomer, but he has said, I don't want to lean on the transfer portal. And the thing about it is, I get why they're rubbed the wrong way by this stuff. So not only do I not see it as fear or desperation, I don't even see it as a negative. I see a couple of guys here who, just like me or you, if we were the head coaches of these programs, would have absolutely no reason to be excited about these facets of the sport changing. Now, you could come in right now, if I had a co-host on the show, if Jesse were sitting out here and he were supposed to be the yin to my yang, he was supposed to be take B to take A, he would sit there and he would say, well, yeah, but the only constant is change. Just every baseless platitude you could think of. Not because that's the way Jesse lives his life, but that's the way some producer would be in his ear telling him to respond. Yeah, the only constant is change. Well, those guys can't expect the world to sit still forever. No, of course they can't. It doesn't mean they have to be happy about it. And especially in Nick Saban's case, I don't think there's been anyone that has shown a better capability of adapting on the fly than him. You're talking about a guy that, when all is said and done, will have totally overhauled his program 2 different times and stayed on top of the sport. Like, do you know how crazy that is, by the way? Imagine it's 2050. Nick Saban's been retired for like 5 years since then. It's 2050, and you're telling your grandkids at that point about this guy that just dominated the sport, went full scorched earth for like a decade and a half, 2 decades, and then the little kid asks, well, what was he? What kind of program was it? It was really defensive-minded, right? Well, it was at one point. Then what happened, Grandpa? Then all of a sudden he had one of the best offenses in the sport. Ooh, wow, I bet that was a tough transition, huh? There must have been a little dip. What was the Valley like? 8 wins? 7 wins? No, they were still playing for national championships. You mean to tell me he totally reinvented his program at cruising altitude and like they never dropped off? Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. Insane. So you're going to have to excuse me if I don't think that guy is immediately scared of another change that's come around the bend. Now, here's where the paranoia sets in. All of them have it. I look at Clemson, Dabo Swinney with the portal. I look at Saban, Alabama, NIL, and what he said about NIL is, I don't like the way it's being used right now. It's not liking NIL. With Dabo Swinney, he said, my preference is to not use the portal, but he's also said, hey, if my opponents are doing it and we don't do it, I guess I'm willingly putting us at a disadvantage. I may have to rethink things. Doesn't mean he has to like it, but it also, in his frustration, doesn't make him desperate. But I get the frustration in a more overarching manner for anyone who's a winner right now. Because if you think about it, once you get to the mountaintop in this sport, everybody's got their eyes on you. You're in everyone's crosshairs. They're gunning for you. And that's hard enough. That is hard enough to maintain success even in a static environment. But now, if you're winning, Alabama and Clemson have been winning programs for a while, not only is the rest of the sport out there spending every waking moment figuring out how to try and beat you, the sport itself is shifting under your feet like it never has before. So it almost feels like you're competing on multiple fronts like you've never been asked, like no one's ever been asked to do before. I'm not saying the sport has always just been static and the same, but certainly no one's going to watch this show and tell me, oh, the level of change in the sport over the past 5 years, it's just always been that way. Of course it hasn't. That would be a major lie. Of course it hasn't. So, yeah, I get it. I guess I can't be hating on someone if I would be the same way. Now, here's what I will caution. I will caution you guys. You might just talk Dabo Swinney into using that portal. And if Clemson decides to pull the trigger on the portal, I mean really pull the trigger on it, they're going to dominate the portal. I don't even need to tell you what's going to happen if Nick Saban is allowed to recruit in the NIL era, because they're already doing it. They just signed, in my opinion, the best class he's ever signed there. That's a 16-year run, big sample size. And also, as I've told you on the program already, some of you believe it, some of you don't, they're not really having to lean into NIL all that much. Josh just said Alabama doesn't use NIL. No, he didn't. Josh just said they're not disproportionately outspending anyone in NIL. And the perception is they are. They aren't. That's bad news, by the way, for anyone who thinks they already have kicked it into high gear. Alabama's not the only one. Ohio State's not a huge spender. Georgia's not a massive spender. These top programs that you want to convince yourself are only on top because they're outspending everyone, they're not the culprits. They don't have to. That's the whole point. That's the great catch-22 in the room. They're not the ones who have to overcompensate with the wallet for what they can't produce and can't provide in terms of proven production. It's a funny thing when you walk through someone's facility and they got a loaded up trophy case, and then you walk through someone's facility and there's a 24-hour loop of the previous 3 NFL drafts, and it's just player after player after player, and their graphics on the wall with 6, 9, 10 zeros on the end. This is the combined amount that our players have made in the NFL over the past decade. All of a sudden, kids look at that and say, well, if they're offering me $35,000 and another program's offering me $60,000, am I really going to let $25K be the difference relative to what could be the difference in my life 4 years from now if I go here versus there? The way NIL's working is not necessarily the way people think it's working, is what I'm saying. So no, I don't think they're necessarily desperate. I just think things are changing. Things always do. They never stay the same, and I think both of those guys will be fine, although I felt like this segment was ending like 3 minutes ago. Although, if you want to doubt Dabo Swinney, there's a different conversation to be had, I think, because with Dabo, it's just this unwillingness to dive into something. And if you look at the talent level on their roster, they're not Alabama. They don't recruit automatically top 5 every year. You know, it's going to be an interesting little case study. Me and producer Jesse were talking about it earlier. It's going to be an interesting little case study come this fall. That is not a supremely talented roster. It's a very, very talented roster. Yes, it's the most talented in the ACC. Yes, they don't measure up apples to apples, player to player to programs like Georgia, like Alabama. So may not matter in ACC play, or maybe it will, but come playoff time, there is a chance that you watch Clemson on the field with one of those teams, and all of a sudden, for the first time in a while, it doesn't look like they have the same caliber athlete. And that wake-up call, that'll really be when folks start to look at Dabo, if he doesn't already do it before then, and say, are you seriously going to continue to have this resource at your disposal, a resource that's tailor-made for you, and voluntarily not use it? It's not like the NCAA slapped Clemson on the top of the head and said, you were banned from using the portal. The leader at Clemson, God bless him, it's part of his value system and his principle system. That stuff, that's something you cannot etch in stone, because the other guys get to use it, and they're going to use it, continue to use it. You got a competitor that you have equal odds to in the ACC this year in Florida State that has very effectively used it. I don't know. We'll see. I still believe Dabo knows a little bit more about Clemson than me, but we'll see.